as we close out Native American Heritage Month. Um, all right. Um, and here Miss Prairie Rose is joining us now. Hello.
Hey, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can, perfect.
Awesome. Hi, Prairie Rose. How are you holding up?
I'm good. If you start to hear little whines and cries, the puppies are right next to me. We had to move them to a larger space. My dog had puppies 4 weeks ago, and they are ginormous. They're huge, and there's 11 of them. So I'm all right. If all the things around this pandemic and what's happening in our communities and election hangover, these puppies are keeping me going. So
Definitely. 11 also sounds like a lot too.
yeah.
Um, and then also just wanted to send some love, because I know that you're based in North Dakota right now, and the COVID cases are hitting in particular ways in your state. So wanted to send love and appreciate you taking some time despite all that you are managing.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been difficult. We've had a lot of losses where I'm from. I'm on the Fort Berthold Indian Reservation in western North Dakota, and we were hit late with the pandemic, and now it's rampant through our communities. It's absolutely knocking on everyone's door if it hasn't invited itself in already. And recently we've lost quite a few elders, and even just this morning I read about the losses, and I knew so many more families that were affected. It's incredible. It really is. And I hope people are not dying for naught, and families are learning and will start to see what's happening by seeing these numbers be reduced. People are hopefully keeping each other safe now.
Definitely. Yeah. So I definitely appreciate you taking the time and want to just hold that. I think that I tell folks that we're navigating multiple crises right now. A global pandemic is one. I know that folks are really feeling the effects of a climate crisis. I think folks were thinking we were at a brink at a democracy crisis as well. So just continuing to send love, and hope you continue to get the care and community that you and everyone else tuning in needs in this moment right now.
Oh, thank you, Gregory. And right back at you. I know you keeping the movement fire going with your Freedom Fridays and all these conversations, and you have such incredible energy that it's good to even just be in a virtual space with you, because you lift up so much love and light, and your community is incredible and how they support each other. So I appreciate it. It feels isolating sometimes here in Western North Dakota, but we know that you and others are out supporting us and making sure that we are reminded that it's okay to take some time. It's okay to create that space that you need for healing and comfort. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Well, hopefully through the course of this conversation, we can learn more about you, learn more about how we can support you, your people, and how we can continue to build stronger bonds and ties across multiple communities. And so for those just tuning in, thank you so much for joining the Conscious Conversation hosted by Can't Stop, Won't Stop Consulting. I'm super excited to be joined by Miss Prairie Rose Seminole, currently with the Advanced Native Political Leadership, organizer for decades around issues of justice and rights. So hoping to kind of dig into that as part of this conversation. And of course, a Native American, Indigenous person with make sure I'm pronouncing this right, Prairie, the Arikara?
Arikara.
Arikara, okay,
Yep.
Arikara and Northern Cheyenne?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
And so wanted to particularly lift you up, and I know we're closing out Native American Heritage Month, but the work of centering Indigenous rights, self-determination, and sovereignty is ongoing. even outside of this month. So wanted to also lift that up as well.
Yeah, for sure.
So one question that I love to ask people when they join, and I'm curious to hear from your vantage point is, who are your people?
Well, I'm the daughter of Lynette and the daughter of Delbert Seminole, two folks who were on completely different ends of the spectrum and somehow were brought together and produced some kind of amazing kids. I'm one of 6 of my moms, but there's 14 of us all together. And I'm a twin. We're fraternal twins. She's like very athletic and runs marathons, and I have horses and puppies. So we're athletic. We're physical in different ways, very different ways. But my people are, my sisters and some brothers in there who we just keep each other up. We just keep each other up. We hear what's happening across the country, and there's a lot of people like me, actually, fairly progressive voices in our communities, but are isolated within our rurality or even just political ideologies. And how we move forward collectively is knowing that there's these fires lit all across the country. And so I'm just with those fires, prairie fires.
Awesome. What's one thing that you wish people knew about you being a twin, or your experience as a twin, that either gets like lost in the shuffle, or that's not something that you normally get to talk about a lot?
Oh gosh, yeah, we don't talk about it a lot. Most because we're very different people. She's was a lot more extroverted, and I was a lot more introverted as a twin growing up. And it's funny because because I was shy and more introverted, I actually made a lot more friends, and then she would come in and steal them from me. Just kidding. She didn't steal them from me, but I was like, hey, they were my friend first. But one thing that I think people are surprised at is that we were really close when we were little, and then we kind of drifted apart to find out who we were independently. And that was kind of a rough patch during our teenage years and young adulthood. But we're best friends now, and it's kind of the situation where if I need to call somebody and get me out of a jam quick, like they're the number one person I would call, really. And we didn't always have that, So I'm grateful for her. But she does run half marathons. I've actually finished I've finished 5 out of 6 half marathons. So I would never have done that if I was not related to her.
Yeah, it's definitely, probably it's not the same, but I have a younger sister who's a year younger than me, and we, I think it took us some time to actually get close, because because we were a year apart, she was also, and she's a year younger. Like, as we grew up through elementary and middle school and high school, I would have sets of teachers and whatnot first, and then there'd be lots of different comparisons and whatnot. And so it took me us both graduating from college for us to kind of realize the importance of kind of having that strong bond and relationship, and what that could mean for us and each other. So I think that there's some connection in that regard, in terms of the arc of relationships with siblings.
I think just with siblings in general too, especially as I move, past my 20s and soon to be past my 30s, it's like this reality of seeing each other as adults, and seeing, especially my younger siblings, like it was a journey to actually see them as adults. Even into my 20s and 30s, I was all like, oh, they're grown. Like, they're making decisions. They're going through experiences that adults go through. My youngest brother got a divorce from, his first wife, who were high school sweethearts. And to watch him through that journey and to find love again, even now, stepping into marriage another time, it was incredible to be like, wow, he's having a whole list of experiences that I can't relate to in this moment, because I don't plan on getting divorced. I don't plan on, having some of these experiences that he has. And it took me a minute to be like, he's grown, he's an adult. I need to see him as as an adult. And that was really hard because I felt myself the caretaker role and wanting to like come in and swoop up all my younger siblings and rescue them. But to see each other go through lived experiences of our own it's a journey, and I appreciate them so much more too.
Absolutely. I think it's like a important balance, right? Like, how much are you supporting them? Where do they actually want the support? And like, what's the best way for them to kind of go through that experience and to live that experience on their own, but while still feeling the love and the care from family and other loved ones. Definitely a sometimes tough balance.
Yeah.
So another question I want to ask you is, when was the last time you felt brave?
Oh gosh. I think leaving my job recently with the church. I used to work for a large progressive denomination in the United States, and I was the only Indigenous person there. I was the only Native in the whole church-wide structure, and as advanced and progressive as we move things to even be more so during my time there, I needed to leave for my own health and well-being, my emotional health, and the toll that it takes to be the only one in a white dominant institution, white hetero patriarchal dominant institution. It took a toll, and it was a lot of emotional and just an incredible amount of vulnerability that nobody should have to do that when it comes to racial equity work and establishing an alignment of heart and minds. Like, you shouldn't have to take such an emotional toll to get others to see your own humanity, right? To see your humanity, and then to see your people in some element of humanity, getting them to our whole selves. But it just took a toll. It started to drain, but I could have been a lifer in that position, and that was really hard. It was hard for my mom and for others who saw me as a lifer in that position. And it was, I would say it took some bravery to challenge them, but also like leave in a way that wasn't shaming or blaming, but also holding them accountable, if that makes sense. So here's this white dominant culture that I don't fit into, and people are trying to get me to fit into this mold, and I'm here for my Indigenous communities, and that's always going to come first. But to hold this institution accountable to the work that still has to come, like they've made inroads into creative policy around inclusion and diversity and kind of some of these 30-year-old metrics that really don't apply to racial justice work anymore. But it's a start in some of these organizations. Like, okay, we're moving forward, but we need just more radical folks. And I think there was some hint of being brave, some hint of being radical, and some hint of like, I need better grounding. Like, this job is not grounding me. And so what do I need to do to ground myself in the work that I'm doing?
Thank you for sharing that. What's something that, I guess, to kind of just build off of that, like what is something that you take with you from that experience? Or what is something that you feel like you're going to kind of carry forward in terms of even your other organizing experience, or even in your identity as a person of faith, especially doing organizing and like justice work?
I think the biggest lesson I am walking away from that work is, how incredibly important relationships are, and how incredibly important to understand that, yes, we come from different lived experiences. So there's going to be this element of healing that has to take place between the change work that we want to see in the communities who were disrupted or displaced or in other ways removed from these systems that govern us. And there's risk in that, right? There's risk in the relationship building, but there's so much power in that relationship building as well. I mean, what I was able to do within the infrastructure of a church-wide system and make it much more equitable for Indigenous and people of color, communities of color, there was risk there, and people were shook up, because when you challenge the system, folks who helped create that system took it as a personal affront. And so they took it personally. And so then it was these very intentional conversations about how do we move from our individual values and separating them from the system that we think is lifting and holding those values in place to help people, right? And it was this reality check and a gut check, and and trying to do that in a way that, again, is not shaming or blaming, but really taking a deeper dive of like, why are we having this reaction? Why are we so angry that we're getting more people who we've othered before into places of power now? And that, I think that lesson was just strengthened within the church-wide structure, because I came in as an organizer. That's why they hired me, right? But the expectation of what I would do was a completely different audience from what I was used to. But then it took me a few hard lessons over the course of my first year and be like, we're all people. Like, get back to that organizing 101. Relationships matter. Relationships are valuable. How do we get into these spaces, and just building from there? So I think that's the lesson. I mean, I always knew that lesson, but it's one of those things that's like, nope, it's true. It's all about relationships. The relationships matter. Relationships build power. We can make changes, incredible changes, when there's more of us collectively.
Yeah, that's super powerful, because I think even as I think about systems or even institutions, right, those are made up of people who are in relation with other people. And so even if you have a particular power or privilege, like there's like your relationships and your dynamics with people and communities will help inform that. So I that totally resonates, and I agree that relationships are key. There's this quote here that says, Jesus lived faith in action, so we should live our faith in action even when our choices challenge the dominant culture. So what does this mean to you, and how can we encourage others to also live their faith in action?
For sure. That was also one of the first times I was ever memed. I don't think I remember being memed before that quote came forward at a youth gathering in I was in Florida when that was happening. And that was a really hard place for, actually, if I can take you to that moment. It was a month after my brother was killed by law enforcement in Western North Dakota. It was a week after my dogs were killed in a horrific situation between my sister, who's in recovery now but was in the throes of the addiction because of the loss of my brother's life, and one of the people who dealt to her, a dealer, and it was just this tragic thing where they killed my dogs. And so I'm in this space, and I have to interpret these gospel readings to this mass audience from an Indigenous perspective. And I don't remember the text exactly that brought me on that path of Jesus living their faith in action. But I remember that was my response, even in the hardships and throes of hatred and violence, and just the threat of giving your own life up for a cause that you believe in. They still showed up. Jesus showed up. He continued to help people and heal people and do what was good for those in need in the best way that he knew how to give that help to those in need, and just continued through. And so my job, even though in the throes of grief I couldn't just take off from my responsibilities, was still just show up, be vulnerable, be in that space of grief and loss with this group of people. And I was so grateful that particular group of people worked in the field of youth. They had to be much more emotionally vulnerable just to work with the positions that they were in, and we're so receiving. And for them, the feedback I got from a lot of my experiences there and the stories that I told, because I cried on stage, I laughed out loud on stage, I did all of the emotions with my storytelling, because that's how I reach people. And during that time, my stories were much more personal because of the grief. And folks said, I've never had to attend a gathering and be be vulnerable before. That's the feedback I'm getting. And folks just learned how to see in another way, um, and hopefully root them into that idea of our faith in action is more than just showing up, for sure, but we don't have to separate ourselves from our professional lives. We can continue to be our full whole selves faithfully within our personal and professional lives. And that's the big takeaway for that piece. Like, regardless of what's happening in the world around us, we can still be good people. We can do what we're supposed to do, but most wholeheartedly if we live those values that we stand for out loud and understand those values. That's the important piece too, is like getting people to individually look at their own personal narrative. Why are your values these, right? Why do you stand for justice? Where does that come from? Why do you stand for love and community? Where does that come from, right? Knowing that part of yourselves is powerful. I mean, it took grief and loss and tragedy in my early years to really understand why family is so important to me, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why love and community is so important to me. And I think that's a reality and a lived experience that many Indigenous communities have, but it's through those trauma pieces that are bringing us together right now. And I hope in my lifetime we don't have so much trauma in our experiences as Indigenous and people of color, and how we can be there for one another, but we are sharing the celebrations of our community and our accomplishments and our opportunities. And I hope in my lifetime that we're paving, a strong foundation for that road ahead for the next generation to keep building and building and building.
Well, thank you for modeling what you're saying. I feel like you've been extremely vulnerable. I feel like you've named some grief and some of the challenges that you've navigated, continue to navigate. And my hope, and I think the work of the firm is that's at the heart of it. It's like, how can we actually bring our full selves, all of that, all of those aspects of who we are, all of those lived experiences, and how could we actually be able to show up fully no matter what space we're in and no matter who we're around. And I think that's a grounding point for me, because I realize as I'm more comfortable in who I am and more comfortable in my own experiences and how that shaped me, I am able to step in more to myself and to my power and to my leadership in a different way. And so my hope is that more and more of the folks feel that sense of power and sense of self and in all aspects, and even the ones that, even the pieces that maybe aren't the most positive, right? And so I definitely appreciate that. And I'm seeing here a comment even from Dana around the coddling of those in dominant culture can be exhausting. That's so from reflections on even this conversation around, especially as marginalized folks and particularly BIPOC folks, like how do we, the navigation of that is an ongoing process. And even being able to take that ownership and feel like we can fully step into ourselves requires a lot of work on our end, and even kind of uplifting and support from loved ones and community. So I definitely feel like it's an ongoing process, and appreciate when folks are able to model and show what that looks like in more and more spaces.
Yeah, for sure. And I have to give a lot of credit too on a national level to, the Black Lives Matters movement for bringing forward our Indigenous voices. So much of our invisibility and erasure, is parallel to the Black experience in this country. And for this movement to bring our voices forward as well in a collective way has just shown us how important it is for us to see ourselves right now and see our unity amongst each other, how important that is right now. And especially such a incredible year like 2020, when we saw so much division across our country, and here we are, building this movement, this political power, not just with advanced Native political leadership and the work that I do, but collectively, there's such a hunger to feel a part of something that we can be proud of again. And that's being led by, communities of color in a huge way. And it's beautiful, so beautiful.
Yeah, I definitely feel like the concept of solidarity, the concept of building across race, particularly across across communities, particularly across race, I think is something of most importance, especially in this time where I feel like there has been more attacks. Folks are feeling the particular disproportionate impacts of COVID and the health crisis that we're facing. It's Black and Indigenous folks who are facing the impacts of that in deeper ways. And so being able to make those connections and to build those stronger, in understanding that like white supremacy survives and is able to, maintain because of divide and conquer tactics that try to divide us. And so it's a even more healing and powerful to know that we are like rejecting those notions and not allowing to be used as wedges between other communities, and that we find more and more ways to build that solidarity and that connection and that shared community.
For sure, for sure.
Um, so I want to pivot a little bit to talk a little bit about, one thing that we wanted to talk about was like truth and speaking our truth. I think there's an element of speaking our truth as individuals, but even in the context of November. November is Native American Heritage Month. And many folks last week were celebrating what they learned to know as Thanksgiving, right? And part of what as I become more politicized and understood more of the history, um, there's there's a different story than what many folks are like learn in school. And so, can you share a little bit with us, Prairie, around like what's the story you think folks should know about what folks are calling Thanksgiving? Some say Thanksgiving, some are call it other things, but what's the story that you feel like you want folks to know, and what's the truth around what actually happened and when these colonizers or settlers tried to take space here?
I'm so glad you asked that because I prepared like a 4-day PowerPoint for just the intro. Just kidding. But the reality is, right? Like, very few Native families will say no to an opportunity to gather, especially when there's food. And so Thanksgiving has become a holiday that, even our communities have participated in, and knowing the real history of it, we still came to gather. Always, with a fist of saying it's not the true story, but here's our experience. We're still going to gather. We're still going to be thankful. But the reality too, with the story of the Wampanoag, uh, the 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 simple idea that they just showed new settlers how to survive and shared a meal, as romantic as that is, and it most likely happened, I'm sure. Um, I wasn't there, but the reality is that that story comes with a huge uh, shadow of violence and destruction across the indigenous community in the world at that time. I mean, the disease factor alone, wiping out, in some places, 100% of communities and villages. My own people, the Arikara, were wiped out by influenza and smallpox on several occasions, along with the three affiliated tribes, the Mandan, Hidatsa, Arikara people. Um, each of our nations has a story of death and tragedy when it comes to disease, and then war with removal and displacement. Um, I travel to the East Coast, and I'm such a novelty in some places because there's very rare that people interact with an indigenous person from the East Coast. We exist, we're all over the place, and a lot of my friends on the East Coast and the Southeast and Northeast, have tribal affiliations as well as descendancy from stolen people. Our African, the slave trade that resulted in the killing of indigenous people, but bringing in African people, and then our peoples intermarrying, right? So there's a lot of tragedy in bringing our communities together. Um, but I think that's part of the beauty too, is that we were brought together, and to see it in that light. Um, we could talk all day about Thanksgiving and the reality of, of the violent history we're in relationship with as Indigenous people to the holiday. But I think people need to remember too, we're in an era of pandemic and crisis and um, division, and the truth of this history needs to be told because it's part of our healing. And if we're moving from healing spaces and places to create meaningful policy, right? I mean, there's less than a third of the United States um, educational curriculums that even teach American Indian history beyond, I think, what, the 1900s. I mean, we're still taught as a history lesson, right? We're here. We're still here.
Yeah. Well, one thing that I like to share with folks is, that there are multiple truths, right? Because I think people are like, well, Greg, why are you trying to like put a downer on the holiday of Thanksgiving? And it's like, look, I actually think it's important that we continue to be grateful and thankful for different things that are in our lives every day of the year, not just even one day in November, right? But at the same time, I think it's as I've become more conscious and as I've been more politicized and understand the kind of whitewash histories that we're told, and that I feel even more of a responsibility to tell folks like, look, this is like, it's okay for you to feel like you need to be thankful and spend time with family and use this as an opportunity to do so, but make sure you understand the context of how this holiday came to be and
Right,
what the full story is,
right,
and be able to help at least know in the context of your celebration or experience that like that there's a different perspective. And so I think that's been an important thing that I've been trying to offer to folks is like, look, like that's not to take away the need or the want for us to actually celebrate and be thankful for the blessings and things that we have in our lives, but not at the expense of a continued erasure of
mm-hmm.
like attempted genocide,
Right,
the attempted displacement and the violence and the oppression that indigenous folks faced, and also like enslaved Africans who were literally stolen from another land to then build a system that we're operating in now, and that
yep,
like it even being like and me like sharing with folks that I feel like that's an important framework that we should understand. It's not, some folks are like, well, it's a blip in history. No, that's actually the foundation of the system, the capitalistic system that we are operating in now. Like, and that's a
right,
foundational to like why these systems and things are literally stacked against us, because they were designed because of the dehumanization of indigenous and black folks,
right.
and as time went on, other sets of people of color, but grounded in that. And so that for me is an important part of the conversation. And it's sometimes rocks a lot of feathers and boats, and when like I bring that up, but I think it's a responsibility that those of us who are familiar or at least have some knowledge of the history, that we try to right the wrong by making sure folks understand, or at least are given the opportunity to hear the alternate perspectives.
Oh, absolutely. I think even just challenging that whole idea in naming, like, here's a hierarchy of human value. And it started to be in play and practice in the establishment of the governance system around us today. And that's why people think it's still okay to put kids in cages. It's still okay, to remove and displace families, right? Like, and pull them apart, separate them. Because that hierarchy of human value is in the way we govern, it's in the way we teach, and even if we don't name it the way that's simply hierarchy of human value, we're going to see it in our history books if we teach those other ways of being and knowing, and the other side of the story, right? A story that isn't so romantic and beautiful, that establishes some idea of manifest destiny, and putting again in play that hierarchy of human value and seeing others as less.
Mm-hmm.
just think of like the governance of this country utilize the Onondaga's principles and system in the same way that they established it. Sure, they had the executive and the House of Representatives and the United States Senate, as that kind of democratic piece. But the one element they missed in the forming of the governance of this country was the role of the matriarchs.
Mm-hmm.
The matriarchs could remove any person of power because they were unfit to rule. Just imagine if we still had that matriarchal worldview. Sure, we'll steal the food and the governance structures and all the medicines from the indigenous people of this country and not give them any credit, but we'll take that governance structure and only take what works for the white men. So it's accountability. I mean, can you imagine that world? I mean, be a whole lot different than what we have today.
Yeah. I mean, that kind of leads me to my next question, Prairie. Is like, when we think about the concept of like healing and healing from intergenerational harm, intergenerational trauma, like what do you think is needed for, like, I guess, Indigenous folks and for other communities of color to move towards healing?
It took me a long time to really understand the moving relationships into restorative practice, right? Because that's emotional work. That means there's going to be some vulnerability because we are challenging ourselves. We're challenging the narratives that we grew up with about our people and others. And when it comes to building relationships around healing, it's the systems around us that have justified that, right? Our founding documents, our elected leaders, our public institutions all upheld, divisive policy in this country. I mean, for over 100 years, we were an autocracy, with people coming to the vote, actively engaged in politics, but at the same time denying, Black people and Indigenous people and anybody of color the same right to vote, the same right to drink from a water fountain with them, right? Like, it's these practices that are in place that continue to this day. And if we're going to diffuse and deconstruct all that, we need to establish those practices that are restorative. And that's the truth, right? The truth and narrative, and sharing that and getting to a place where the next generation will be disconnected from that trauma, but closer to that healing. And the more each generation goes towards that healing road, the easier it's going to be for meaningful policy to be passed for all of us. So if another pandemic comes, we're not going to be evicted or have to, drive 3 hours for a COVID test, and we'll have food and we won't lose our jobs, right? Like, we'll have a policy in place, a governance system in place that takes care of people versus corporations, right? That healing piece, though, is I'm only healed so much from the trauma of my father's generation. And there's so much of the work that I can do, but there's some of that I'm too close to it and I can't. And so I'm trusting that the next generation, being one generation away from that trauma and another generation into the journey of healing, that they'll be able to continue that work and keep moving it forward as much as possible. We only do that together. We only do that with the acceptance of each other's experiences and narratives. And I don't know why that's so hard. Like, is it such a radical idea to understand or to believe that Indigenous people and communities know what we need to move forward, right? With all of our communities, and that radical idea that we can change the systems that we're in. I don't know. I believe it. Maybe I'm just a hopeful reformer, but.
Mm-hmm. Well, I appreciate this piece around like restorative. Like, can you talk a little bit more about that? What that means to you, and like to maybe help have that be more concrete. What is something more like what's a restorative practice or something that you feel like we could kind of take on, or what's something to help people better understand what that means to you? And
Yeah, so when it came to the truth and healing work, I've been starting to do, for a long time I talked about reconciliation, and it took interacting with an elder, about a decade ago, who was that reconciliation means that there's a time in our history that we can go back to that was good for all of us, or maybe just good between you and me, but it was might not been good for everybody, but good for all of us. And for Indigenous people and the United States government, when we talk about reconciliation, there's no point that it was like good for us. There was always policy of genocide, removal, assimilation, displacement, breaking apart families with the boarding school, etc. Right? So there's this, like, I couldn't use reconciliation anymore because there was no point in our history that we'd go back to where it was good. And having conversation about restorative justice, when we talk about formerly incarcerated or people who are incarcerated now, like there's a lot of practices we want to put in place for reform and restorative justice. But restorative practices for me and the work that I do really came from this point of speaking the truth and sharing narrative and building on those relationships with those who want to be accomplices in this work of justice, but didn't know how they were being their own barriers. And so again, it goes back to that conversation of values and personal narrative and where we come from and why we're so passionate about working for something that is work worth doing, but it's hard work, right? And so for me, a restorative practice that I implemented early on was just kind of accepting that there's other ways of knowing and experiencing. So my story and my history isn't going to be the same as your story and your history. But can I hear that without saying, well, that's not what I was told or taught? I wasn't taught that, so it didn't happen, right? So not continuing that erasure, right? But acknowledging that other people have a lived experience that I don't have, and I don't have to own that. I don't have to intrude on that in any way. I can accept that that's the way that is, and find places then, how do we move together, right? Without the oppression Olympics, without the crab in the bucket, lateral violent oppression stuff where it's like, well, that's not my experience, and they didn't do that, or they used 20 years ago, so they're an addict, they're not fit to do this kind of stuff. No. I believe fundamentally that all of us can change. I've seen it, and walking into a room and not being the dominant culture has taught me to at least listen, at least find, I don't want to say common ground, because it's not always common ground. It's just, what's the point of connection? How do we connect? And the healing that takes place, acknowledging like what you said hurt me, the experience of my people, the history of my people, and bringing that truth forward, holding people accountable. That isn't an easy space to be in, and I don't ask that people do that, but the what you said earlier, we have this responsibility to inform and say the truth. But for me, that restorative practice is, there's many things that you can do, but keeping it simple to what you can do today is just be mindful of your own bias and how that's creating opportunities for others or yourself, or being a barrier. And when I asked a lot of white men to do that, I'll tell you there was definitely pushback, because they're not racist and they're not patriarchal. No, the system is, again, that personal narrative versus the systems that we're in. And are we a barrier? Are we benefiting from that?
Yeah.
Long conversations being had.
For sure. I think just to build on that, I'm curious, like, and maybe this could also be about how talking a little bit about some of your work now with advanced Native political leadership, but what does it mean to build power for Indigenous people? And what can folks who are not Indigenous, people like me, like what's a way that we could support and help build towards power and that power for Indigenous folks and that vision?
Thank you for that. Yeah, you people might not know this, but we're Indigenous people in this country are the most legislated people in the United States because of treaties. You think that we can leverage our sovereignty and uh, uh, systems and governance that we have now. We can absolutely do that. However, our lives are an act of Congress, right? From the protection in our communities. Oops, puppies are grabbing my cords here. Um, to the healthcare and education that everybody gets, right? We pay taxes. We are accountable to the system of governance around us. Um, and uh, when it comes to the decisions that are being made about our lives, it's not necessarily at the state level. There are some happening at the state level, but most of it happens at the federal level. And think of VAWA, for example, the Violence Against Women's Act. In 2000, oh gosh, I want to say 11, it was finally passed with provisions in there to protect Indian country or Indian territories. Even though Senator Murkowski was an author on that bill from Alaska, they changed the language to the language of Indian territories, where there's no Indian native land in Alaska, if you can believe that. So our lives, you know, in the Constitution, we're the merciless Indian savages, and then there's all these other policies and treaties that are in place prior to the Constitution that haven't been upheld. But then, if there's some piece of legislation moving forward, we are not eligible living on Indian territories for any of that unless we're specifically called out by name by American Indian Alaska Native tribes. So the Violence Against Women Act, you know, protecting, you know, women from their abusers, implementing funding or sending money to implement programs that protect women and children, funding, you know, safe houses, funding law enforcement, funding detectives to do investigative work. We would not have been included as Indigenous people, where 84% of our women experience violence in their lifetimes, sexual violence from intimate partners. Like, we would not have been included in that. So if I was assaulted on my territory by a Native person, because there's federal law enforcement on our reservation, we would have had jurisdiction. For other places who had a non-Native offender, which is the majority of offenders in Indian country are non-Native offenders to Indigenous people, we would have had no jurisdiction to seek any type of justice or healing from that incident. So if I were assaulted by a non-Native person, tribal police did not have jurisdiction. And what's the point of doing a rape kit? What's the point of going to court when you have no comfort that the justice system is bringing any comfort to arresting the perpetrator or seeing them go through the court of law? It won't happen. So 2011, back to that piece, bill gets passed. They pass the bill and realize, oh, we just forgot Alaska, where there's like 2/3 of the Indigenous people and the recognized as American Indians, Alaska Native people, federally recognized Indigenous people in this country. We just left 2/3 of them out. So it took years for Alaska to be included in that piece of legislation, but that made all the difference. I mean, there was so many, you know, people experienced violence in their communities, in rural communities, and there was no resources. And in this country, that's unacceptable. It's absolutely unacceptable. Every person should feel some sense of safety, some sense of comfort in the justice system around us. And I can guarantee that you ask any of the Indigenous people living around me or people of color in this state, none of us have that feeling.
Mm. So there's a lot of work to do, a lot of work related to recognition of tribes, recognition of tribal nations, and even just in what you were like what I'm hearing you say too, just like for folks to feel safe and feel like they could be them full selves and get that the care and the community and love that they need to not only survive but thrive. So what's as we are kind of getting ready to close out here, are there any particular calls to action that you want to share with folks about the types of things that they could or should do?
Absolutely. Definitely follow Advanced Native Political Leadership on all your socials. Follow some of my friends over at Indigenous Environmental Network. I used to do some policy work with them as well. And other allies, Illuminatives, Indian Collective, especially if you want to have those harder truths and you're ready for it, like, and you're ready to take those next steps. Advance is really new, so we will appreciate your funding and your support. And our allied organizations, our partnered organizations, have a lot of call to actions as well. So feel free to just start waking up with how we pay attention to those around us who are not like us, right? Follow the pages, and show up however is being asked of you, whether it's donating, giving resources, maybe it's volunteering your time, hopefully post-pandemic, right? We all can gather safely again. But show up. That's the most important piece. Where you are in your work or personal lives, people are doing land acknowledgements, which is one way to bring us into the space that, especially when we're not there in that space, do that land acknowledgement, but also recognize that that's not just the work you have to do. We have to start thinking about how we're bringing Indigenous leaders forward and making changes around us. And that's why we're hoping to run even more candidates in 2022 and 2024, Native leaders, stepping them into our systems of governance. And, you know, when we do better, we all do better.
Definitely. Well, I encourage folks to follow Prairie Rose, follow Advanced Native Political Leadership. I see they've dropped a comment there in the chat. Advanced Native PL is the handle, and continue to educate and to take control of that journey of your own consciousness and political awareness, and how you could also be a stronger ally, stronger accomplice, stronger co-conspirator in this ongoing arc for justice for Indigenous folks, for Black folks, and all people of color. Thank you. Yes. Thank you so much, Prairie Rose, for joining us. It was a very fruitful conversation, and we will definitely be in touch. And if there's anything that I could do or Can't Stop Won't Stop can do to support, you know how to reach us.
Oh, thank you, Gregory. This was great. Appreciate you all having time.
All right. Take care.
Bye.